The little group picked up their pace and moved swiftly for some time. They saw no sign of any inhabitants. The amount of abandoned furniture decreased, and nearly all the doors were gaping open holes. Distance is hard to gauge by eye when you are underground, but Karen tried. She estimated that they had moved about 3 kilometers when they heard a sound other than their own somewhere in front of them. It was clearly the noise made by someone moving carelessly among the little rocks and other debris of the tunnels. Somewhat emboldened by their numbers and very anxious to find a way out, they approached the perceived source of the sounds. With any luck, this would finally be someone who was familiar with these surroundings and willing to show them the way. Their wishes were halfway fulfilled. They did indeed find someone who was very much at home there. It was a group of large rats, rifling through a heap of trash. They didn't seem to mind the newcomers, at least not at the distance they kept. Karen and Chetna both gave vent to little sighs of disappointment, but Tisha and Ardish seemed more intrigued. The two youths crouched and started collecting small rocks while keeping the rodents fixed with their eyes. Having gathered a dozen or so each, they rose and stepped forward slowly in unison. They only took a few steps, spoke to each other briefly, and then threw their rocks at one especially large rat. The first hits seemed to daze the creature, all of its companions fleeing instantly. It was then pelted with rocks from the slowly advancing hunters, while Chetna and Karen looked on in astonishment. Once the rodent was dead, the youths exchanged a few cheers and compliments, found a sharp rock each, and started skinning and disemboweling their prey. "I say," exclaimed Karen. "The advantages of a countryside upbringing, I guess," laughed Chetna. Tisha and Ardish smiled up at them from their work with pride and joy. "Now at least we have good nourishment for a day or so," said Tisha. The rat meat was quickly cut into thin strips, then cooked lightly in the lamp, using 2 pencils from Karen's bag to hold the pieces over the fire. All the while, she and Chetna analyzed this new development. "It strikes me that we must be in the vicinity of someone's living quarters," said Karen. "Yes, this trash must come from somewhere, and given how many rats were here, I'd say it is refilled regularly. How do we locate the owners? Do you think we can find our way to their dwelling from here?" "I should think so. There is much dust and debris in these halls, so there should be some traces to mark a more frequently used passage." This felt like a much more substantial plan than just wandering aimlessly. It felt like a proper chance. Once the meat was done and Karen had gotten her coal stumps in return, they set about looking for tracks. The ground was carefully examined around the trash heap. First, they looked only at the immediate vicinity, but could spot no particular differences in the various directions. Then, each passage leading away from that place was examined systematically for about 100 meters. There were, of course, only a few main corridors passing that place, but they also included the ones radiating from a nearby intersection. Having examined all of them, they finally agreed on following one in particular. It seemed to have a lesser concentration of debris down the middle, as from frequent use as a thoroughfare. It was with mixed exultation and apprehension that they discovered more and more signs of this being the right track. Most notably, there was a blacking of the ceiling which, once discovered, became their main feature of reference. It must have been made by people passing to and from, holding smoking lamps, for it was quite clearly marked. The path did go down a flight of stairs, but this didn't worry them, since they were already far down and lost. After that, it was not long before they all stopped simultaneously, holding their breaths. The unmistakable sound of voices had reached their ears. Now they all stood there like statues, each listening intently. Where did these voices come from? What manner of people were the speakers? What did they say? Karen was convinced that they were all pondering these exact same questions. The voices did seem to come from further ahead, but among the myriad passages and chambers, determining the exact location of a distant sound was utterly futile. Considering the problem of approaching these people without revealing themselves, Karen had an idea. She took off her bag and then also her tunic. Replacing the bag over her shoulder, she draped the tunic over the lamp, dimming the light considerably. She then whispered, "Let us advance a little further. Either we can spot their light before they see ours, or the location of their voices will become clearer once we are close." The others nodded their assent and started moving forward. The voices had been some way off. Even knowing how deceptive sound can be in such an environment, Karen hazarded a guess of 100 to 200 meters. As they got closer, she tried to make out what the conversation they could hear was about. The sounds were gruff and guttural. The timbre seemed to remind her of dwarves, but the inflection didn't suggest their tongue. Actually, it was remarkable that she could not make out one single familiar word. Having lived among Arcaport's multicultural masses for so long, Karen had a fleeting acquaintance with a large number of languages. She couldn't remember the last time the identity of someone's parlance had so completely escaped her. Judging by rhythm and volume alone, though, the subject matter seemed trivial. Soon, just like when Karen had discovered the light of her new friends, they saw a reflection on a wall ahead. Sneaking into a nearby apartment, they put their lamp on the ground with the tunic over it, thus leaving them in near complete darkness. Karen and Chetna stood at the door, peering down the corridor towards the point where they hoped the strangers would pass. The distance was no more than 50 meters, and they could already hear the approaching footsteps clearly. It was the sound of a briskly moving party with several members. Then they appeared, 5 figures, 2 of whom were bearing lamps, visible for a few moments only. They were large, tall and heavy by human standards, but there was something not quite human about them. Maybe it was the way they carried themselves, backs and necks hunched as though holding something heavy. Maybe it was the faces, prognathous and thick. Karen racked her brain. She knew of no humanoid species like them. Maybe they were just humans of a particularly rugged build? She couldn't decide, especially with such a short glimpse. One thing was very clear to her as she glanced at Chetna's face beside her. The strangers had inspired the same feeling of uneasiness in both of them. "What do you think?" she asked quietly, once the footsteps of the other party had dwindled a bit. Chetna drew a few deep breaths, face set rigid and eyes flitting back and forth. She was wrestling hard with her decision, but once the answer came, it was with a determined look. "I think we must follow them, at least as far as we can without risking detection. In my opinion, it is our best chance of finding a path to ground level. And if following them leads to nothing of value, we also have the direction they came from to investigate. We should mark it somehow." "I agree fully, though it scares me. I'll get Tisha and Ardish," replied Karen. It took but a moment to explain their decision to the other two before setting off. The sound on the other party had receded considerably, but was still audible. Determined to close the gap somewhat so as not to lose this opportunity, they advanced quickly to the point where they had seen the others pass. So quickly, in fact, that they actually collided with someone at that intersection. It was another one, just like they who had gone before. He came jogging from the same direction the others had originally come from, as if a straggler trying to catch up. Chetna bounced right into him, face to chest, and fell on her bottom. It could have been comical, had it not been terrifying. Even though they had only a dimmed light and the stranger had none, they saw him much clearer than they had seen his predecessors. He was indeed large, and even though his physiology was similar to a man's, that he was clearly not. His nails were more like stubby claws, and when he opened his muzzle of a mouth, they saw his great fangs, like those of a baboon. He was sparsely dressed, had a bag over his shoulder, and carried a short, thick staff in one hand. He seemed as surprised, and initially as terrified as they. But regaining his composure before them, he started yelling loudly in his strange language, obviously trying to alert his comrades to their presence. Meanwhile, he kept menacing the little group with his cudgel. Chetna had regained her feet with the swiftness of a cat, and while the other three made as if to flee, she aimed a vicious blow to the stranger's jaw. Twitching his head backwards, he managed to avoid most of the attack. Nonetheless, blood spurted freely from his mouth as, with a beastly roar, he assumed a fighting stance. They all froze and looked on in disbelief. Chetna could not weigh more than a third of this monster, who was also armed. But there was not a trace of fear in her expression or bearing as she faced off against him. Seeming determined to finish the encounter quickly, she dashed forward aggressively, presumably to get inside her antagonist's guard. He, in turn, stepped back almost as fast, striking a backhand blow with his weapon. It struck Chetna nearly full in the stomach, slamming her against the wall by sheer force. She had caught part of it with her right elbow, but Karen doubted that it had helped much. Seemingly not feeling any pain, Chetna pushed his massive arm aside while he aimed another blow with his unarmed fist to her head. Ducking inside and under his oncoming attack, she struck a blind left to his chin that connected fully. It dazed him so that she had time to take one short step back and aim a quick second punch to his abdomen, this one with even more force behind it. Karen still stood petrified, staring incredulously. Chetna must be a true prodigy of body control if she could generate so much power so quickly. The way she had manhandled Karen earlier paled in comparison. With the last strike, her opponent had folded his midsection until their heads were almost level. He was obviously in great pain and out of breath, but Chetna was not done. Drawing one deep breath and planting her feet firmly, she delivered one final attack, a merciless uppercut squarely on the chin. With horror, Karen heard the loud crack of multiple bones breaking as the man was thrown up and backwards. He fell instantly, legs bent at the knees, hands thrown out, and his head at a weird and disgusting angle. Chetna relaxed for a second and then winced hard with pain, clutching at her stomach. All of them rushed in to help, but she raised her head with a scowl. From between clenched teeth came one imperative grunt. "Run!" As soon as the word was out of her mouth, they all became aware of the sounds of approaching people. The preceding party had heard their comrades' cries and were coming to investigate. Again, Chetna was the one taking the initiative. Mastering her pain in an instant, she took the light from Ardesh's hands and rushed back the way they had come. They ran close behind her as she retraced their route for some distance. Soon they heard screams of surprise and rage, then sounds of swift pursuit behind them. They had rounded a few corners by then, but Karen quickly calculated the distance they had covered and knew that they had at most a 200-meter head start. Feeling very sure that their only chance to avoid capture was to throw off their pursuers immediately, she quickly made up a strategy. At the next intersection they passed, she took Chetna's arm with a succinct, "Wait, I have an idea." She then took the light and uncovered it, giving them a good light for a few seconds. Looking up, she saw, as she had thought, that not all paths had equally blackened ceilings. Then, Replacing the lamp's cover, she led them down a corridor which lack of soot pronounced it to be the least used. Her idea being that they would have a better chance of getting away, or hiding, in an area as unknown to their pursuers as to them. It was difficult, at first, to tell whether the hunters were still on their track or not. They only heard the same clamour of anger and hasty onrush as before, coming behind them. Then it seemed for a while like they had succeeded, as those noises became slightly more distant and finally ceased. This seemed promising until a few moments later, when it was resumed with great vigour. Apparently, their enemies had just stopped for a while to locate them by sound. This caused Karen to feel both disappointment and hope at the same time, for while their pursuers were now definitely on their track again, it also meant that they had lost it for a moment. Having passed several branching paths since they deviated from the more used one, it felt as if they now had a real chance of getting away. Those chasing them would not be sure which path to follow, and must either rush on blindly or try to track them. Thus, either they would be likely to pick the wrong corridor somewhere, or they would be moving much slower. Nonetheless, it had made none of them feel much safer, so they kept running, trying to choose the least likely of routes. As the noise behind them died away for a while, Karen decided to try yet another strategy. Choosing a gaping door in the middle of a long hallway, she led the others through it. Hitherto, they had always followed the main corridors or streets of the underground city, thinking that the apartments must be dead ends. But, reasoning that their pursuers might have the same prejudice, Karen thought it worth their while to explore if that was true. Even if so, it might nonetheless offer a good hiding place. Chetna was still able to run fast, but she seemed very focused, offering no comment on these choices. Karen felt certain that she was in great pain. Tisha and Ardish were following passively, having obviously adopted Karen as second in command after Chetna. The apartment was ornately decorated both inside and out, reminding Karen slightly of dwarvish reliefs. They passed through hall after hall, even finding furniture left in some places, mostly of wood. It was an almost maze-like place, but they found no other obvious exit. Karen was just about to ask advice on whether or not they should try to stay hidden in there when they came to a stairwell. Apparently leading down into another apartment just below, it offered a great opportunity of escape. Going down and exiting on another level would likely throw their pursuers off completely. Doing so, they found that the stairs continued down further, but elected to descend only one level. Looking through all the rooms of that floor, they soon concluded that there were no exits there and headed back to the stair. Just as they reached it, though, they heard a sound from upstairs. For a while, the sound of pursuit had been quite distant, but now it seemed close again. Were there pursuers in the apartment, or just passing by outside? Tisha pointed down into the stairwell with a panicked face, and everyone nodded in agreement. Karen, holding the light, went first. She wanted to run, but was convinced that their only chance to get away lay in stealth. Her legs and lower abdomen cramped up with the nervous strain, making her feel stiff and clumsy. Then someone stumbled slightly in the stair behind her, putting a hand against her back to steady themselves. This made Karen stumble too, tripping on the steps and falling forward. She was nearly at the next floor down, therefore not falling far, but she landed on her face, and the lamp, crashing against the floor, went out. For a split second she lay still, listening intently for signs of her fall having been heard. The others too stood in silence. To their dismay, they could hear those above shouting excitedly and then come closer. Just before falling, Karen had seen that the stair continued downwards. Now, as she told her companions to follow, they all descended further in darkness. Karen couldn't determine how many levels they passed going down, but just kept going until she came to level floor. That it was more than one floor down, she was certain. As yet, there was no light behind them, but the sounds were coming closer, so she headed away from the stairs. Making everyone hold on tightly to the person in front of them, she went forward, hugging the wall. Again, it was apparent that the people behind didn't know exactly where they had gone, but it was also apparent that they had descended the stair and found the spilled lamp oil. Their exultant screams made Karen quiver with fright. Grabbing a hold of Chetna, who was right behind her, she pulled on her to indicate that they should move faster. Hand outstretched, far in front and only slightly touching the wall, she now shuffled quickly ahead. She dared not run and cause too much noise, or trip again. The wall soon became very irregular, like bare rock. It also started winding, making it impossible to know how much their course tended to one direction or another. After several intersections, where she just chose a heading at random, the path started slanting downwards. It became quite steep, but the floor was nonetheless smooth. After a long and winding descent, the floor became level again and the wall veered off sharply to the side. As she tried to follow it with her hand, she felt her way barred by some hard and irregularly shaped object. At first, she was startled at the unexpected blockade. Then she assumed it was some sort of furniture and began exploring it with her hands to find a way around. The more she felt of its shape, however, the less sure she got about its nature. Sometimes, a familiar line would make her believe that she knew what it was, only to merge with something utterly perplexing. It was most disconcerting, running into something so alien when immersed in total darkness. Her companions, too, started making exclamations as to the unexpected things they discovered all around. Slowly moving out from the way they had come, they felt their way around a plethora of weird, rigid objects. These were of very differing shapes and sizes, and they all seemed stuck to or part of the floor. Eventually, they came to the conclusion that it must all be part of an extremely complex decor. That left them with the question as to the nature of the room they were in. Whether a museum, a religious structure, or something completely different, they had no idea. None of them had ever, as far as they could remember, been to any similar place before. At first, they had tried to get through as quickly as possible. But as the very irregular shape of the place made progress not only difficult, but also somewhat perilous, they soon stopped. Listening, they heard nothing. Had they finally gotten away? As time passed on, they gradually, with growing relief, believed that they had.